Hey, I'm Angela of Axe Root Homestead. If you're confused about where to start when it comes to designing and laying out your permaculture site, this video is for you. You can read and research and watch videos and gather so much information about how other people are setting up their permaculture homesteads and farms. But if you're absolutely confused about where to start when it comes to designing your own farm or homestead in a permaculture fashion, it can be overwhelming. So we're going to go over a few bits of information to help point you in the right direction and get you started. Here's the thing that most people don't realize. All of the information and tools that you need in order to set you off on your path to designing your farm are already in your farm or homestead. So what that means is by queuing into what's already going on your site, observing, gathering information, you'll be able to formulate solutions and know exactly where to put everything. All right, so let's break this down into 4 simple steps. Step number 1, observe and gather information. I recommend before starting anything on your homestead or farm site, you just wait and observe for a year. I know it sounds like a long time, but we want to make sure we see every single season. We want to gather data and understand how snow piles if you live in a colder climate. Where did the drifts form? Where does the wind come in during the warm season versus the cold season? It changes, at least on my homestead it does. We want to know where water pools, where does it run off? Is there erosion occurring? We need to run soil sample tests, but also we need to understand what wildlife is already existing on the property. You may not realize that there's a fox trail on the lower half of your land. You may not realize that the hawk nest is in this particular tree over here. So we wouldn't want to put a chicken coop or make livestock housing where it's going to interfere with wildlife traffic. So we really need to gather that information. By running soil tests and gathering samples, we're going to be able to devise a plan for improving soil quality, whether that be with compost, if you're into synthetic fertilizers, or by using cover crops. We're going to get an idea or a sense as to where to put high traffic patterns, not only for our own feet, but for livestock. If you have heavy horse beats, you're not going to want them to degrade the ground and sink into mud in the off winter seasons. So there's a lot of information that we really gather by just watching and waiting and trying to understand what's already going on around us. For example, when I first moved to my farm, there's a nice open clearing. The land is fertile from when it was a cattle grazing area in the 1950s, and I thought this is a perfect place for the fenced-in annual vegetable garden. I didn't realize it did this. Yep, turns out this is a floodplain, and it's not just a small pooling of water, it's a massive rush of water that would have completely annihilated and removed all of the work that I did. So there was definitely some time, money, and energy saved in observing and learning that and putting the garden elsewhere. The other thing is that, especially if you're starting by bringing in new livestock, is there may be animals you don't necessarily need to bring in because Mother Nature is already providing those animals to perform that service for you. An example would be owls. If you are moving into your homestead or farmstead and you find that you have a rat or a rodent problem, yeah, you might bring in a couple of barn cats to help offset the hunting of the owls in removing those rodents. But you wouldn't want to bring in like 12 barn cats, because then guess what's going to happen? There's no food for the owls. And so what's the owl going to start going after? Chickens, potentially cats, depending on the size of the owl, guineas if they're roosting in the trees. And so it's all a balance when you're creating a permaculture ecosystem. You want to make sure that you're not just thinking about the own livestock that you're going to bring in, but the residents that already live there. Okay, so we've observed, we've gathered data. Step 2, we need to define our goals. So what that means is, what do you want to fix? So for me, with that floodplain example, I know that my garden isn't going to go there. I'm going to put the garden somewhere else, but also a riparian zone or some sort of a buffer filtration system would be a good idea to filter out all those pollutants on my farm. So that means now I have 2 goals, a garden location, and I've also got the riparian zone. And maybe through observation, I learned that we've got an eagle that actually is down by where the lower pasture is going to be. So I'm not going to want to put a duck coop there. I'm going to want to shift it away a little bit. I'm also going to want to install a livestock guardian dog after learning I not only have an eagle, but I have foxes. I learned I have bear, coyote, fisher cats. You get the idea. Sometimes we see problems, such as the pooling that I have in my area that's a sacrifice plot for my horses. And it is soggy ground almost year-round, horrible water absorption when it comes to soil, and really it's just a bad situation for horse hooves. It's going to cause hoof rot. So now that tells me that I need to put some bioswales there. And in putting the bioswales there, it's gonna catch the water, it's gonna hold on to it, slow it down, and slowly release it into the soil over time. So in learning these things, in gathering that data, it's pointing us in the directions of what our goals should be. Okay, so we've gathered our data, we have formulated our goals. Now we gotta brainstorm. Step number 3, brainstorm how we get there. So it sounds really great to go through this whole ideation phase, but if we don't have steps in place to get from point A to point B, it's going to be overwhelming to try to implement the final design process. And so we need to brainstorm how we're going to get there. So for the bioswale example, I just talked about the pooling in the sacrifice plot. Should I bring in machinery? Where exactly are those swales going to go? How is that machinery going to get there? The first step would be to create a level and go ahead and mark out the contour lines of where that bioswale needs to be. That's going to tell me if I'm going to be able to have enough access for machinery to get in there. I already did this. Turns out I didn't. I used a shovel. The best way and easiest way to sort of just get this brain dump out on paper is to create a map. It can totally be haphazard. Just create a sketch of your property. I'm a graphic designer, so I geeked out on the computer and I mapped everything out. Even better if you can use Google Earth or get a land survey. Make a copy of that and just start plotting out where you want things to go. You may not have as much room as you think. The whole idea is just to get all of the ideas down on paper so you can brainstorm how much access you have, how big exactly something is going to be, where exactly to the inch it's going to go. It really becomes sort of a refined, detailed process of what we need to do in order to make all of these goals actually happen. Okay, so now that we've brainstormed, we just need to get to the last final step, number 4, which is to design and implement. So let's go back to the garden example. I had this space in mind for the garden, turns out to be a floodplain. I had to put the garden elsewhere. In my case, I moved into a home that already had a garden in place. It was old, covered in weeds, and the raised beds were dilapidated. For me, it was pretty simple. I knew exactly where the garden was gonna go. I was gonna keep it in the same spot, and I ended up just tearing down the raised beds, completely weeding the whole space, installing new raised beds that weren't falling apart, and then putting in pathways, and that became sort of garden proper. I also knew that in addition to this, because this is gonna be a space for annuals, I was gonna grow perennials and create food forests elsewhere. And so I had an exact space to work with. I knew how big it was gonna be. Then I was able to map out how many raised beds I wanted. I was able to figure out the exact amount of lumber I needed and get it delivered, what it was gonna cost. And so now we've gone from this observation of, okay, this garden space that I wanted turns out to be a floodplain to having lumber delivered. This entire process is completely contingent on you observing your land, gathering that data, formulating goals that serve your exact landscape and microclimate, taking into account all of the residents in terms of wildlife, insects, deer, mammals, reptiles, birds, everything that already lives there, and understanding how that's going to work into the ecosystem that you are creating. Don't waste your time, don't waste your energy, don't waste your dollars. Do yourself a favor, observe, plan, brainstorm how to get from point A to point B, and I promise you, the process is actually going to get easier the more that you practice it, and you'll have your permaculture site established in no time.